Hello, I'm Cheryl and welcome to my sewing room. This is the 9th block in making the Beginners Sampler Quilt. Now there's 12 blocks in all, so if you're just getting started and you want to know what the other blocks were, click on the playlist at the very end of the video. It comes up during the last 20 seconds. It'll be in the top right-hand corner. It also lists the supplies needed for this quilt. Okay, let's take a look at this block. It's called Geometric Square. Okay, now what you do is you start out in the center with one square, you put some little triangles around it, and then finish it off with rectangles and squares. This block is pretty fast to make and not a very stressful block at all. So I think you're going to really enjoy this one. I did. Okay, so let's take a look at the supplies. All right, remember all of the blocks in this quilt has a finished size of 12.5 inches squared. I'm using my fabric A and C. Now in this quilt I have 3 colors I'm using, A, B, and C, but in this particular block I'm just using 2 colors. Now remember, you can use as many colors as you like. All right, so out of fabric A, you need to cut 4 3.5 by 6.5 inch rectangles. You'll need 1 4 3/4 inch square and 4 3.5 inch squares and 2 4.5 inch squares. So these last 2 pieces are out of fabric C. Okay? All right, now if you're just getting started quilting and you have no idea how to cut out your quilt fabric, watch the video Tips for Cutting Quilt Fabric, and I take you into great detail on how to do that, and it'll be really fast process for you. This is the block layout, and the letters in the little areas there represent what fabric you need to have lined up there. So this is fabric A, fabric C, and so forth. Okay? All right, let's get started. Take your 4 4.5 inch squares of fabric C and stack them together because we're going to cut them in half. So take a ruler and place it corner to corner. Once you have it lined up with your rotary cutter, cut them in half. Okay? So now you have 4 little triangles. Okay, so now take 2 of your triangles and line them up on opposite sides of the 4 3/4 inch square of fabric A. And then do the same thing, and you're bringing right sides together. Now, when you're placing these on there, try to have about the same amount of fabric hanging out past the edge of the square on each side, so it's even, and do the same thing here. Then go ahead and pin and stitch 1/4 inch along this edge, and same thing on this edge. And then with your iron, press this seam and then this seam. Okay? All right, now you're going to open those 2 rectangles up, triangles, and open them up, and you're going to press on the top, pushing the seam here out and away from the center of this square. Okay, so press on both sides. Same thing here, press that seam out and away from the center of the block. Okay, now we're going to trim off the excess, but before you trim it off, you want to make sure that it's still the right size, which is 4 3/4. Also make sure that one of the lines on your ruler is straight across on these seams. That's also important because you don't want your square to be lopsided. Once you have it lined up, then you're going to cut off the overhang that's there. Okay? Now, turn the block and do the same thing. Put your 4 3/4 inch line on there, line it up, make sure everything looks good on all edges, and then trim off your last 2 sides. Okay, now it should look like this. Okay, so now take your last two triangles and bring again right sides together or front sides together. Okay, and when you're placing it on that edge, again, make sure you have about the same amount of overhang on each edge over here. Okay, and do the same thing on the opposite side. So get them all lined up. Once you have it lined up, then go ahead and pin and stitch here and here. Stitch 1/4 inch seam and again 1/4 inch seam. Then with your iron, press on the back side. Okay, now once it's pressed, you're going to open it all up, all of your rectangles, or excuse me, triangles, and press again on the front side. So now you have this rough looking square. So now we're going to square this block to 6.5 inches because right now it's larger than 6.5. You're going to focus on these 4 points right here. You want to make sure that when you're trimming this block that you have at least 1/4 inch of fabric out beyond the point. So you're going to cut just some of this off, making sure you leave 1/4 inch right here on all 4 corners. So take your ruler, and the first thing you're going to line up is where the 3¼ inch line is on the ruler. Place it on this point and this point, okay? So place it on there. Then line up your 1/4 inch here so that it's going out and away, 1/4 inch away from that point before you hit the edge of your ruler. Do the same thing over here. Make sure the 3¼ inch line going this way is lined up equally on these 2 points. Making sure you also have at least 1/4 inch of fabric sticking out all around. Now the last thing you want to look at before you cut is on your 6.5 inch line here and here, there should be excess fabric. Then you know you've got it right. Okay, so once you've got everything lined up, and take your time because if you don't have this block squared, your whole block is going to be off and it's not going to look right. So cut just 2 sides. So you're going to cut this side and then you're going to cut this side. Okay, so now you've got 2 sides cut. So we're going to trim the other 2 sides. So take your block and turn it. Now here's my previously 2 cut edges here and here. So now take your 6.5 inch lines on the ruler and place it on those 2 previously cut edges. Okay. Then before you do anything else, verify that you've got enough fabric hanging out past those other 2 points. All right, once you've got everything lined up, then trim off your last 2 sides. Okay? There you go. So that's what it should look like when you're done. Okay, so now lay out all of your blocks. Take everything you have and take your 4 rectangles and place them on each side of that square. I always lay my pieces out before I begin stitching everything together. It's like your little road map. You know where you're going when it's all laid out in front of you. Okay? So after you get all this laid out, you're going to begin stitching the rows together. So you're going to stitch all of these together, this row together, and then this row. So I usually like to start in the center and place your 2 rectangles right sides together on top of that center square. Line up your raw edges on this side. Then go ahead and pin both edges down and stitch 1/4 inch here and 1/4 inch here. Then your last 2 rows are done the same. Lay your blocks on top, your squares, Place them on the raw edges on each side, then pin and stitch a 1/4 inch here and here. And again, do the same thing over here, stitching on these 2 edges 1/4 inch. Okay, so now we're getting really close to being done. So here's what your rows should look like when you are done stitching them together, okay? Now I'm going to go over how to press these rows, because your pressing is so important. It will make your block lay nice and flat if you press it properly. All right, so in the center row, I'm going to turn it over so you can see the back side. These 2 seams right here are pressed out away from the center of the block. Okay, so before you do anything, you're going to press on the back side of your seams. Then open it up, and when you go to press on the top, you're going to push against this seam, forcing this seam to go away from the center of the block, and press it on top, okay? And do the same thing on the other side. Push against that seam and press. Okay, so now you've got this row all pressed and ready to go. Now your next 2 rows, you're going to do the same process. You're going to press on the back side of all your seams. Okay, so now the seams in this row and this row are pressed in towards the center of the block, in towards the center. So when you go to press on top, you're going to keep this rectangle lifted, push against that seam, forcing it to go towards the rectangle, towards the center of the block. Do that on all of those last 2 seams here, all of them, okay? Now once your pressing is done, we just got a couple of more little steps to go. Lay your 2 rows on top of the center row, and now you're going to line up your seams. You're going to match them so that they're going in opposite directions. So the seam on the bottom is going in the opposite direction of the seam on top. Now get them in nice and close, make sure it feels flat. Always pin your seams first to secure it so that while you're stitching it won't slip. And then go ahead and match up this one. Pin it. Then after you've pinned your seams, pin across and stitch 1/4 inch. And do the same thing on this row. Matching your seams, making sure they're going in an opposite direction, pin it down, pin across, stitch 1/4 inch. Okay, one more little step. It's an easy one. So now your blocks have been, your rows are all stitched together now. Now you need to do your final pressing. So always press on the back side to flatten those seams out. Then lift up your rows and press on the top side. But you're going to keep the row lifted a little bit, pushing against this seam so that it goes out and away from the whole center of the block. Okay? All the way across. And do the same thing on this seam, pushing that seam away from the center of the block. And press all over the block, and there you go. I really enjoyed this block. It wasn't difficult. It went along very, very quick. Okay? But remember, take your time on squaring this center one. After that, it's a piece of cake. Okay? Let's look at the next one. It's a heart. This one has very few pieces, not a lot of work having to be put into this one. You have 2 half square triangles that are really large, 1 long strip here, and 4 smaller half square triangles. Really quick and fast block to make. Okay? Well, I hope this was helpful to you. I do hope you take on this project. Now, to keep informed on all my future videos, click click on one of my subscribe buttons. There's one up there towards the end of the video in the upper left-hand corner. It's a little round picture of me floating around. That's a subscribe button. Then throughout the video, there's one down there in the lower right-hand corner. It's red and it does say subscribe. Click on either one of those, and then YouTube will prompt you for your email address. Enter that information, and the next time I have a new video, YouTube will send you an email with a big button in the center. You click on that and it takes you directly to my latest video. I'm Cheryl, and I'm really glad you came to my sewing room. I'll see you next time, and happy sewing.